and welcome to another episode of Doubl3Tap. Today we are joined by Sean. For anyone not familiar, Sean is co-founder and CTO of B3, a gaming L3 that settles to base. So yeah, we're going to kind of dive into the B3 vision, talk a bit about the infrastructure, a bit about the consumer application layer, and kind of, get an overview of everything that you guys are building. So excited for this one. However, before we dive in to the meat of the questions, Sean, what games are you currently playing?
Yesterday, so I'm here in Oregon visiting like a sister-in-law, my wife's sister, and was introduced to a super fun game we've been playing called Boomerang Foo. It's like an indie game available on all the platforms you would expect, where you are like a cute little fruit or vegetable or pastry, and you run around with a boomerang, and you like in a casual game style try to like slice, throw the boomerang or like short distance melee attack the other players in various capture the flag or like last man standing style mini games. But it's been super fun because the short lived sessions, and I don't have a ton of time these days to like go deep and play like a Diablo 2 or like campaign style game. So I've been doing like these little short mini party games with friends and family.
Is that on Switch, or I don't think I've heard that game before.
Yeah, I've never heard of it either. I think it's like totally just like small indie game. On We play it on a Switch, but I think it's on like what you would Steam and etc.
Yeah, enough gaming talk. We'll get right into it. So yeah, Sean, stoked that you're able to join us. Thanks again. So kind of just getting right into it. First question. We went through the white paper a handful of times, and one of the topics that caught our eye was this concept of L3 density. So we're curious, like what sort of tools, frameworks, features, or any other like kind of aspects are top of mind for you guys when you're making blockchain integrations easier at the layer 3 level?
Yeah. Generally, I think when we think about L3 density, some of what we're talking about, and my personal opinion on this is that like we have a lot of block space that is available that isn't being used, and our ability to produce more block space, is essentially on a curve of like we're going to get better at it as an ecosystem, right? Not just within EVM, but even across other blockchains, you have competition. And at the end of the day, like what we're trying to do on the protocol side is provide enough block space, fast enough block space, good block space in terms of security, proper decentralization, et cetera, to the general public and the masses so that we can build these applications on top of it. And so you start to see this with like roll-up providers like, Conduit, Caldera, et cetera, that kind of built from being like an agency style model to now like platformizing the product. And then the next step, of course, will be to like make it permissionless and even easier to deploy. And I think over time, like what you see is like block space becomes easier to access, and it becomes this like, well, what kind of superpowers, apps, et cetera, does that enable? And so like we're planning for that future. And so I think if you accept that like providing block space is going to be pretty easy, and that like over time, like the competitive cost of providing block space, I think becomes like trivially close to providing the hardware itself, right? There's some margin on top of hosting specialized software, absolutely. But at the end of the day, like if you use this, an AWS or one of these cloud providers to host your nodes or to host some part of that protocol, like your margin is going to be like over the hosting cost, right? And so, if you're building a game or you're trying to move a game on chain or really build like a proper application, it's not just block space, right? You need tooling and infrastructure rolled out on top, and you need it rolled out like kind of like automated, especially if you want to get to a world where you can provide block space almost like ephemerally, like per session even, right? In some like several steps from now case. But even if you just give you a block space, it's no good if you can't, there's no liquidity on there, you can't move, there's nothing to do except to like record something on a blockchain, right? And so you actually do need this like infrastructure to be rolled out, including, bridging. You need like liquidity for those bridges. You need to provide analytics tools and monitoring, and depending on what you're doing, like you might need specialty things like FHEs, encryption, private state. And those are all like, I think of them as like modules, right? And I think of these blockchains also as almost like sidecars or modules that you plug in to service this application that you're trying to build. I think that's where like the world is going, and we want to be able to help provide that infrastructure and that tooling for companies who are using to utilize that like next generation of infrastructure.
And then could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on like how your guys' approach differentiates, maybe with respect to like the B3 chains and maybe within the context of gaming?
Yeah, so gaming is a really interesting use case because, I think a lot of the major blockchains, Base, Solana, et cetera, are all building a chain that's like generally very good for a wide range of applications. But when you get to gaming, like the requirements differ a bit from, say, like a DeFi, right? Where if you're engineering a game, for example, not everything necessarily needs to settle in a synchronous format. So, for example, me walking some steps in the game or recording the state of where my player is might not necessarily need to be same synchronous to like me earning a reward or killing a monster or unlocking some kind of achievement, right? And so that's where we derived our idea of app chains from, which is like, well, if you were thinking like an engineer and you're building a production game or application in some other form, you wouldn't stick all your throughput into a single pipeline, right? Single pipeline being like a chain. Most production enterprise applications, you have multiple services, microservices that are utilizing different databases and different things to offset the load, so that if one piece of this infrastructure stalls, breaks, whatever, the entire thing doesn't crash ideally, right? And it's also better for throughput, of course, because you can send some requests over here and some requests over here. And that's, I think, the thesis of the app chains, right? If you're building a game, the functions you perform in your game. So, for example, VRF, right? A very common function for those who might not be familiar, where you want to randomly generate a number and you want to cryptographically verify that was like truly a random number. Very common in games of chance, very common in a number of gaming applications, but not necessarily something that needs to happen in the main chain itself. Right, because those transactions, the processing and the compute to perform those actions, they're not necessarily tied to specific, me minting an NFT or doing a swap on the chain itself, right? And so if you start to build these app chains that perform very specific functions, say like, hey, I have a chain that just does like NFT staking, right? Like it houses all these things. It kind of is the main hub chain for maybe just even NFT activity in general. I'm going to separate that from a chain that does like just VRF and just computes like random numbers, right? Then you start to have like these app chains or service chains where a game can get what it needs from these services, and often in parallel, right? Which helps with the throughput issue and the compute requirements.
Another thing that you hit on was like the issue of liquidity, right? As you kind of go up that stack and you add new chains, right? Liquidity becomes much more fragmented. That becomes a problem for a variety of different reasons. How do you maintain liquidity throughout the different layers of B3?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are working with a number of liquidity partners and bridges, right? So like natively, a lot of the liquidity providers, for example, like Relay from Reservoir, they're kind of like an instant bridge, quote unquote, right? And then there's Across and plenty of these bridging solutions. I think that the best way that we're thinking about liquidity is like there are great well-funded teams who are doing that very like problem right now. We're working on like good seamless cross-to-cross chain liquidity, swaps or bridges, etc. And many of them have solutions that are ready today. Some of them have solutions that will be ready. But in a world where there's like many of these, like what do you do, right? And I think our opinion is like we should be the router. We should try to get these partners to go and deploy their liquidity across, our chain and other like popular chains. We'll work with them to automate that process because they're very much in they would love to add more, right? Like if their business model is making some percent off of the swap, whatever, then the more deployed, the better in some sense, right? And so they also would like to go to this world where, we would be able to deploy that almost instantly and without having to go through any kind of manual process on some net new chain that we deployed for a partner, for example, right? For now, that process is probably a little bit manual, but that's how all things start. And then once you have these liquidity providers deployed, we are working on a product with the folks at ChainSafe that will aggregate all the routes and then find you the best route, best being optimal in terms of speed and cost, right? Cheapest, fastest, and what we think will get the action you would like to do done. So those actions could look like I want to move funds from these other chains to B3. It could also look like I want to mint an NFT, but I have no funds on B3. I only have funds on, I don't know, Base or Zora or Ethereum mainnet, right? And we'll give them the ability to use those funds to perform that action on the destination chain, which is B3.
And then you mentioned kind of splitting up different parts of the game, different parts of the logic across these different app chains. Curious, like how do they communicate with one another? Are you guys doing something special there? And then, just curious what kind of the plan is moving forward.
Yeah, it's a good question and one that we're still formulating a strategy on. There's a lot of good cross-chain app messaging type solutions. The path of least resistance for us is kind of like one of the tried and true like data messaging, type protocols, and our partners at Chains also have their own version of this as well. So it's kind of like natively built into what we're trying to do. But again, I think this falls in the category of like, I don't want to force us to build a solution when we don't know the exact problem, right? And so this is one where, when we encounter a need with a partner, we'll architect that out and choose the best data bridging, cross-chain communication model that works for the application that we need. Yeah.
I'm curious, like, how much of the various things that we've discussed so far, like how much of it is built in-house and how much is being outsourced?
It's a good question. So we have partners that are like, we should have partners by design, right? Because we want the protocol to be decentralized, and that means like many parties typically coming together to like work on this thing. And so we've got all kinds of partners out there that I'm sure Victoria and Daryl have been shouting out through our Twitter and et cetera. The bulk of so right now all of the consumer app is in-house. Some of the protocol work is in-house in terms of like thinking about the account model, thinking about like cross app like solutions for example, like accounts and messaging and like sign in and attribution. Because like, to be frank, like we deal with the problems that the gaming partners are having today. I don't know if there's the right word for it, but the folks who are our partners who are working on other things like providing, putting together liquidity, using a cross-chain bridging solution. Those are like the ChainSafes of the world. Those are the privies of the world who are helping work on like wallets and Third Web, who's working on all things, smart contracts and gaming. And so we're very fortunate to have all those ecosystem partners, but I don't believe it's like a problem that like one team solves. I think it's something that like we all come together to like, collectively provide solutions for.
To quickly double tap on your account system, I believe you guys are referring to it as Sprinter, right? This coalition of different service providers, whether that be AA wallets or the different bridges. Is that all essentially just you're aggregating all of these different services and then providing it into one single B3 wallet or B3 account? How exactly does that kind of look on the back end?
Yeah, so the Sprinter product is largely to bring funds and to perform actions on chain. So it's a separate thing than the account model, which is a different can of worms of like, it's a profile and you have like some shared identity, right? And then we can talk a little bit more about that. But to answer the question about Sprinter specifically, it's a aggregator of liquidity. It's also a provider of liquidity. So there are liquidity pools that the a coalition of folks provide. And then Sprinter uses that as a liquidity pool in conjunction with other liquidity routes. And again, like aggregating and routing to provide the optimized route to perform the action. We wanted people to be able to access multiple funds from multiple networks to be able to do things that are useful to them in a gaming sense. So most of those actions look like I want to send a transaction of some kind. Like I want to execute a transaction against either a contract or deposit or transfer, one of your like simple kind of like movement of funds type efforts. The second is we want to be able to mint NFTs, and we want to be able to like purchase, swap, and do these kind of I want to take this asset and get some other asset back. That asset could be an NFT or could be a token on, say, like a game chain or something, right? So Sprinter is different than some of these other products in that it can let you execute the transaction from multiple chains in one single kind of like bundled route. So if I have dust, and everyone has dust, right? You try all these chains. I have random dust on chains I don't even remember. Like, wouldn't it be cool to really use that to purchase like a simple in-game item or a simple game or something?
So bridges are notoriously like kind of risky. Obviously, Ronin is a top of mind. Are you guys taking any actions to kind of help increase security here, or is there anything that you learned from past mistakes that you're applying to your own Sprinter application?
Yeah, I think it gets a little dicier as you go into these liquidity partners who are also on the bleeding edge of innovation, right? Where they're trying something new, they're trying to make a new like cross-chain bridging solution, and so I think inherently like you have to take a risk in order to provide a better experience at first. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for us to track all of the providers and potential vulnerabilities, but like we need to find good partners and work with them to make sure that everybody is doing this in a safe and secure way. And I like to think that the teams that we're partnering with are, but is there anything particularly novel that we can do? Like, no, I don't think so, right? Like this is inherently you're going to have to trust the blockchain and the smart contracts that power the bridges. And we're not going to try anything weird, right? Like, I think that the safest thing you could do is not do anything crazy out of the ordinary to jeopardize your users' funds, and we certainly will not be doing that.
I want to switch lanes a little bit and briefly go back to something you mentioned earlier that you guys refer in the white paper as service chains. In the white paper, you kind of describe it as essentially the same framework as like server instancing that you see in like MMORPGs and stuff, where you'll I don't know, interact with an instance dungeon or boss raid or something in order to like help manage server load and not get like some of the issues that come with scaling like concurrent users within a confined space. So there's that, right? Like, don't congest the blockchain by creating essentially like a serviced or an instanced L3 is the way I understood it. You also earlier in this conversation mentioned how you'll use or some of the services that you'll offer, like VRF, for example, could also potentially take advantage of this instanced L3s, right? Stopping there, like, could you maybe talk a bit more about this and what excites you about it, where it is in the roadmap?
Yeah, for sure. So our scaling vision and the app chain scaling vision, I think, comes in multiple steps. Right now, we're on step 0. Right? Step 0 is there is a main chain, the V3 mainnet chain, and things are happening on this chain, right? And right now, like we've not hit the limitation yet, luckily, but we are working on step 1, which is, okay, once you start hitting limitations, and you do need like even more block space than what's kind of available out of the box and what you can tweak kind of to get the best throughput you can. What do you do next, right? Like what happens if on Base or on Solana, more than 100% of the blocks, 100% of the blocks were consistently being used. What do you do then, right? If you can't scale fast enough. And so like our theory is, well, you got to pan out, right? You got to horizontally scale. And so step one will be like, okay, now we have a game partner. They have very high throughput requirements or specific requirements, such as like, hey, I need my custom gas token, for example, or something, right? That then becomes in step one an app chain. So that app is a specific game, right? What you're describing of like instances, and we do talk about this in the white paper, I think is closer to like a step 2 or 3, which is what happens if that game then, who is now doing so much throughput that they're congesting the entire block space of an entire chain that's dedicated for them. What do you do after that point, right? Then you start to go into, all right, we need to start like having ephemeral chains even. So chains that exist only for the duration of a game session even, or in instancing, for example, like within a specific, hey, this is the chain that you enter when you enter a cave, right? Because there's enough throughput requirement that you like need to do this in such a way where they represent, similar in game development, like instance server instances that you can like, distribute and have to reduce ping, etc. So is that available today? No, nobody has that, right? Like this is something we have to build, and it's something that we're going to build in those steps.
I'm curious to kind of like ground the conversation a little bit. Seeing as you are only a couple of months old, how you plan on kind of kickstarting the flywheels of growth?
When we look at, the value that we're trying to provide, there's an ecosystem, there's also a consumer app. And I like very stubborn in the idea that like you have to do something on the consumer side. Otherwise you're just an infrastructure provider. And largely, like I think in general, like we need more consumer app builders, right? Like the reality is that, no matter how good your infrastructure is, you still need to attract real users and you need to grow the pie. One of the best ways I think to do that is build a consumer app. We have this consumer app called Basement. It's a few months old. Like I like to think it's a pretty good experience already, but like in total, like, yeah, I have much larger vision for it. And the team is excited to build that site out because it represents our way to bring net new users in. And again, funnel those users and that value towards the games, right? Because we're not a game publisher at the end of the day. And so we do what we can on the distribution side, and we're going to try to grow that arm. And so I think, again, the flywheel looks like you got to bring content in. You got to have better distribution to bring more value to that content that you're bringing in. And then you have to build a flywheel so that the users that you are bringing in see the vision and why it's more beneficial to game in an on-chain sense than to just play traditional Web2 games. It's a tough dream to realize, by the way. So don't want to make it seem like we're going to solve this problem tomorrow, but we are going to try our hardest to work at it.
So we so far covered all of the interesting angles or services that you guys are trying to provide. A lot of that is focused on, or at least in my eyes, is focused on mitigating some of the criticisms around L3s and fragmentation of users and liquidity. If I'm a player and I come and join the B3 ecosystem today, what does that experience look like?
Yeah, we are, I would say, about a week or two away from having a publicly facing like examples of transactions you can do on the consumer app Basement. The experience that will happen from day one when we launch the transaction side will be that you can take your funds from some other chain and be able to bridge that into B3, right? So if you have USDC on Base and you want to get B3 ETH, we'll give that route to you. It'll be very seamless. It'll be very fast. We're also, of course, adding fiat on ramp because, again, we want to like empower the the everyday users, and we have to assume that they don't have crypto wallets at the moment, right? Because that's the pie we want to grow. Shortly after, we'll provide follow-up actions. So you'll be able to, for example, tip game studios. Will have minting as kind of like a core feature set. So being able to purchase in-game NFTs from the game marketplaces, or mint a net new NFT or some campaign style NFT, using funds from other chains. So if you have a little bit of dust, USDC on Polygon, and you have a little bit of ETH on Arbitrum, you should be able to use those funds to be able to mint an NFT on B3, regardless of if you have funds on B3 or not.
That's cool. Nice. Yeah, we'll come back and hopefully test some stuff out. Sounds like Basement is going to be the place to kind of see most of these features live, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
Cool, man. Well, I think that just about wraps it up for this episode. Really appreciate you coming on. We've covered a lot, and it's going to be really interesting to see you guys execute on some of these, like, different services and aggregation, abstraction, etc. So really appreciate you taking the time to come on today.
Thank you guys for giving me the chance to talk about one of my favorite topics, V3. So I appreciate the time as well. And
the content of this video is intended for informational purposes only and should not be considered as investment advice. The views shared by Alex and I are our own, and we may hold investments in some of the companies or digital assets featured in the video.